welcome to the Geoeconomics Podcast. I'm your host, Aleksa Burmazovic, and today I'll be speaking with Mark Beer and Andreas Baumgartner of the Metis Institute, links in the description. Mark and Andreas are respectively chairman and CEO of Metis Institute, and they focus on dispute resolution and policy reform within SEZs, local and even national level governments. And I believe the discussion will be most useful to operators of established zones reaching their zenith, which need to implement small and iterative measures in order to keep their competitive edge. We also talked about how digital technologies interoperate with the perception of a zone's dispute resolution capacity, a recurring theme in today's discussion, as you'll note. I want to thank you for tuning in, and without further ado, here come Mark and Andreas. So I've got Andreas and Mark with me on this call right now. We spoke a little bit previously. Andreas, how are you doing today?
Very well, thanks, Aleksa. Great talking to you.
Likewise, Andreas. The first question that we wanted to go into as far as this dispute resolution stuff goes, the first question I sort of wanted to aim at Mark, and that is, if I'm an SEZ, what does dispute resolution mean for me as a competitive advantage, a competitive factor in trying to attract and maintain investment and presence within the zone?
Well, Aleksa, what does dispute resolution mean for an SEZ? Well, what it means is failure, because to have resolution, it means that you must have a dispute. It means that your environment has not created sufficient trust and certainty to allow businesses to operate without a dispute. It means that they are having to go to a third party to answer a question because the environment isn't helping them to deal with it itself. So at its very core, the most successful SEZs and economic zones are always looking for dispute avoidance, mechanisms to allow their participants to avoid problems, and as they hove into the horizon, when questions come up that they had never expected would come up when they were doing business together, to provide mechanisms to help them resolve it without any formal process. So dispute resolution, when we're talking about courts and when we're talking about arbitration, means failure. So why do economic zones invest in building courts and arbitration centres and the like? Well, the reason that the smart ones do it is that they understand that a court is not so much about the rule of law, which is clearly important, but it's about trust and reputation. An economic zone will not thrive unless companies trust it. And it will accelerate its success if it has a good reputation, a reputation for allowing people to do business easily, a reputation for allowing people to succeed, a reputation for allowing commerce to be safe and secure. And so building a solid platform like a court or an arbitration centre isn't so much about dispute resolution. They're not hoping every morning as an economic zone that there are more and more problems that can be fought out in their economic zone. What they're hoping for is that it provides a solid foundation on which people believe that if there is ever a dispute, which nobody would encourage, that there is a safe, solid, secure, and reputable platform. And by building that environment of trust and with a solid reputation, it actually allows the economic zone to grow at a much faster rate than it would otherwise grow. But it also allows for businesses in that economic zone to succeed at a far faster rate than they would do if they didn't have the benefit of the environment that the economic zone has designed.
So, Andreas, what Mark just talked about is the role of dispute resolution in SEZs as sort of ensuring the existence of trust within the system, within an SEZ. So I was wondering if you could tell us more about the concrete steps that zone or a dispute resolution advisory firm or something along those lines, what sort of steps need to be undertaken in order for this trust to be created within the zone? Does there need to be a dispute that's already been resolved in order for the reputation of the dispute resolution system to exist? What needs to happen?
The key term that Mark used that I would like to bring up again is really dispute avoidance. So it's definitely not a system where we sit down and wait for a conflict, and when it finally arrives, we try to resolve it to prove how good everything is. It is really about sending signals of respect for the rule of law. It's a signal of meaning business. It's a signal of being serious. So in a way, in a perfect world, you would create that resolution platform to send the message to potential investors saying, yes, if ever happens something to you, there will be swift and efficient and effective resolution. But at the same time, we will do everything that you'll never have to use that system. So the first part here is to build up that system to be ready when it is needed. It's like setting up a fire brigade, right? You want to have the fire brigade in place. You want it to be great if there ever is a fire. But at the same time, you hope that there will never be such a fire. In the case of judicial dispute resolution, it even goes one step further, because if parties know that if they don't play by the rules of the game, they will be held responsible, there's a very strong incentive not to ignore the rules. So the existence of dispute resolution mechanisms actually increases business harmony in advance. And then if something happens nevertheless, it resolves those quickly to enable the return to a good course of business. So therefore, and coming back to your question, what needs to be put in place? What needs to be put in place is the right system, the right processes. But at the same time, it's not enough to do the right thing. It's just as important to let investors and to know let the wider public know that those mechanisms are in place.
So it's not about just, if I can make a parallel with, say, a police force in a community, it's not just about there being police that will handle problems that happen. It's also this effect of the police force being present in the streets that makes crime less likely to happen, because people actually see the police presence in the community, which is sort of a parallel to what you just mentioned. So also, what you mentioned also is that this dispute resolution system results in the harmonization of economic relations. And obviously, since the 2009-2011 period, there's been a sort of economic rise period that's lasted up until this year. And in that period, there's been, greater and greater globalization, interconnectedness of all types. And I was wondering how, not just this period, but even the ones before, how they affected the growth of the SEZ dispute resolution markets and others as well. So that's sort of a question that I wanted to aim at Mark, because right now we're in downward facing economy, and I just wanted to sort of understand what the history of this dispute resolution space was before.
Well, lawyers are always happy when the markets are rising, and they're equally as happy when the markets are falling. What's bad for lawyers is inertia. So yes, I think the global crisis which is upon us is going to lead to many businesses needing to fall back on platforms to help them solve their problems. And I suppose your question at its heart was, what have we seen? What's been going on? And the answer to that is, to many people's minds, there's lots of competition. You've got London competing with Singapore, and Singapore competing with Abu Dhabi, and Abu Dhabi competing with Dubai, and so on and so forth. Each of them competing to say that they've got the most effective, the most efficient, the most trusted legal system and justice system to help businesses solve their problem. And to some extent, I can see why people would think that there is interstate competition for disputes. But the reality of it's quite different. Courts don't generally look forward to getting more disputes. That's not a focus for them. In fact, disputes cost governments money when they go through the court. So not many governments are encouraging everybody, please come and spend our taxpayers' money in our jurisdiction to resolve your your problems.
Right.
So generally, courts are collaborating. That's what we're seeing. Greater and greater collaboration between commercial courts, be it through SIFoCC, the Standing International Forum of Commercial Courts, or the Courts of the Future Forum, or the International Association for Court Administration. We're seeing more and more courts collaborate because the geographical boundaries are coming down. Parties have a choice where to resolve their dispute, but ultimately the bit of paper that comes out at the end of it has to travel around the world in order to have teeth. So what we're actually seeing, what's fascinating now, is the competition between courts and arbitration centres. And I call it very much the battle of the ego. You know, every court and every arbitration centre will tell you why they're the best. It's a very sort of ecosystem, let's call it. Everybody telling you why they're the best, why they're the most fantastic, why arbitration is better than litigation, why this process is better than that process, why this jurisdiction is better than this jurisdiction. And actually, that's not helpful. It's helpful insofar, I suppose, that we start to see greater competition, and therefore the inefficiencies of the old system are being removed. But generally speaking, I think that this battle of the ego is not helpful to people who have a problem and need it fixed. And that's why we need to see a migration from an ecosystem of dispute centres to an ecosystem of dispute centres, and an ecosystem where they say, well, you might need my facilities because you're based in Singapore, and Mark may need facilities in London, and we're going to have somebody adjudicating who they like, who's in Malaysia, and we as a collection will make that happen. We will share a common platform. We will allow people to use our physical facilities if needed. All of us working together to deliver what the clients want, which is, can somebody tell us what the answer is to our question? Because at its core, remember, people only go to these courts and arbitration centres because they have a question that they don't know the answer to. That at its core, that's why they've gone. Right? Because if they knew the answer, they wouldn't be paying lawyers millions of dollars and waiting for years to get an answer. They would work it out amongst themselves. So if a client, what they want is the right answer quickly and cheaply, which is generally what they want, with the caveat that overall they'd like settlement, they'd like to resolve the problem, then if we can bring these centres together to collaborate as one, to deliver all of the elements necessary to deliver the right answer quickly and cheaply and to help the parties settle, then I think we'll be doing global commerce a real favour. And it's much of that that the Metis Institute does when we look at ways in which a new digitising economy, a new globalising economy would require collaboration, not just amongst arbitration centres, but also amongst courts and amongst the broader economic zones, because success is going to be success of the collective. The sum has to be greater than the parts to make sense. And in a world of increasing barriers and boundaries and tariffs and borders, we need to find ways of allowing commerce to flow more easily. And I think that's going to be the trend that we'll see now. We will start to see, certainly amongst dispute centres, ever greater collaboration, not only to provide the front end side, an easier way to resolve disputes in a COVID and post-COVID world, but perhaps more importantly on the enforcement side, making sure that whatever determination is given has actually got the teeth to be able to collect across the world.
Oh, absolutely. I think that what you mentioned about the transition from ego to eco systems makes a lot of sense. So what you mentioned also about the international organizations that sort of make up the existing ecosystem, I couldn't tell you one way or the other whether or not they serve the ecosystem or the ecosystem. We'll certainly be linking those organizations in the podcast description, as well as Metis Institute. But I was wondering if Andreas, you could sort of make what Metis does, what the Institute does, make it a bit more clear to myself and the listeners. Like, why is it needed in the ecosystem that you guys are expecting to take root in the coming years?
So the Metis Institute is combining a think tank with specific advisory services, focusing on empowering dispute resolution. So what that means in practice is, on the think tank side, we are focusing on how do we envision the dispute resolution of the future? What are the paths towards that future? How will it be done? What will be the demands during dispute resolution, and as Mark already mentioned, also then during the enforcement. And it's absolutely amazing what's currently going on here, for example, in terms of how to integrate artificial intelligence solutions into the dispute resolution space. So that's just absolutely fascinating and partially really mind-blowing. And we love to be here at the front of those, thinking about those developments. But we don't stop just at thinking about it and fantasizing and blue sky design, but we are working specifically with governments and with special economic zones, in some cases also industry sectors, on specific solutions to strengthening dispute resolution. In some cases, this can just be some seminars we're doing or participating in some internal workshops of special economic zones. In other cases, we're working with zones to basically set up their dispute resolution system from A to Z in a kind of all-in, ready-to-go approach.
Right.
And then there's a third part to the Metis Institute, which is around alternative dispute resolution, where we help find the right mediator or arbitrator for a specific dispute. It's not always that, the lawyers are the best. Mediators, in some cases, you need a finance expert, you might need a psychologist, if it's, for example, family businesses or things like that. So we help on finding the right arbitrator or mediator is the third pillar of our activities.
I see. A part of what you mentioned is, A to Z dispute resolution services, the implementation of artificial intelligence solutions and all of that. And in Adrianople Group, we work with a lot of small-scale special economic zones, particularly in Africa, that don't necessarily have a lot of resources to invest in this direction. So what I was wondering is, what is the scalability of services like this? Because you can't expect a small industrial zone in a poor and developing country to immediately implement artificial intelligence and solutions like that. So I was wondering what the progression and scale of these dispute resolution solutions is going to be for different zones, because obviously Shenzhen does not equal a small industrial park in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So I was wondering, Andreas, if you could speak to that.
Well, both Mark and I have certainly been influenced by our experiences in the Middle East, where the approach seems to be rather far-reaching and radical solutions. But at the same time, at the Metis Institute, we're fully aware it isn't that one size fits all. And actually, if you look at our global network of experts, we bring together experiences from large zones with people who've worked with very small zones. The key to success, especially for the smallest zones, is something that Mark mentioned earlier, and that is about sharing, that is about collaboration. To put a question in the room, why does every zone need to have its own full bench? Wouldn't it make sense, especially in a world where the court sessions are happening in a virtual way anyway, to collaborate, to set up a bench of judges, for example, across multiple zones, and thereby ensure much better utilization of resources? That's one thing. And the other part, of course, is to say, yes, you can go the full way and say you're setting up a court and you're setting up arbitration center and you're setting up your own mediation center. Or you can say, well, in our case, really what we're looking for is just an arbitration center, and we're doing that in cooperation with one of the established providers.
Right, absolutely. So what you mentioned about the sort of digitalization of dispute resolution and how that's poised to be developed, I was wondering if Mark, if you could direct us to some examples of this, digital style of dispute resolution already taking place. Are there any, bespoke organizations already using this sort of service? Are there zones that have already caught onto this trend?
Well, bear in mind, this has been going on for a long time. Colin Rule came up with the online dispute platform for eBay and another company, PayPal, I think it was, years ago. And I think they handle about 60 million disputes a year. Alibaba handles, I forget at the last look, but again, something like 40 million disputes a year without any human intervention at all. So the ability to help people solve problems without the need for human intervention, basically to use game theory and AI-based learning to machine learning to help parties to resolve their problems has been in the ecosystem a long time. But it's not something that's been widely adopted or accepted within judiciaries. And that, to some extent, I suppose, would be because effectively those systems don't require a lot of people, and judiciaries tend to be quite full of humans. Often I ask myself what they do. We did some research before, and the most efficient courts in the world have 4 employees per judge. If you're a smaller court, you might have 8 or 9 employees per judge. But as I traveled the world, I'd be finding courts that have 50 or 100 people per judge. And that inefficiency is what has led to the situation where only 95% of people around the world, when surveyed, and a huge survey that was done for the United Nations as part of the SDG Sustainable Development Goals, 95% of people with a serious legal issue keeping them awake at night didn't visit a court because they said it's slow, it's expensive, it's only for powerful people, it's not for me. So those traditional systems of moving bits of paper around and having lots and lots of people engaged in what at the end of the day is simply helping people come up with a solution isn't working. But yet it hasn't changed over the years, and it hasn't changed because it's a monopoly, because there haven't really been many other places that you could go. You can go to arbitration, which generally costs more money and takes longer than court, with decisions that are less enforceable, or you can go to court. You really are caught between a rock and a hard place. But what we've started to see now is with the digitization of contracts, and that is the use of smart contracts, contracts which are self-fulfilling, so they can calculate what's happening based on input, and they can adjust themselves. If delivery is a day late, the contract self-imposes a penalty on the late delivery and accelerates the rest of the supply chain to make sure that at the end of the supply chain, the delivery happens on time. This is happening today. So what does the future hold? Well, the future holds, I suppose, a situation where we have contracts that are managing themselves using technology, distributed on thousands of nodes around the world, because they'll be decentralized to ensure that they're fair. And we'll have money in the form of, it'll either be the Chinese state-run RMB-backed cryptocurrency. I think there was some hope that we would see it out of Libra, a US-backed cryptocurrency, but that seems to have fallen on hard times. Or it'll be payment made by way of a cryptocurrency owned by the end of the supply chain, say Mercedes-Benz or whoever else wants the contract to be fulfilled on time and to quality. If we've got a digital supply chain, if we've got a digital contract base, and if we've got digital payments, the next question is, where in the world can act as an arbiter over disputes that happen in the digital world? And so as we look forward, not only have courts got to adapt to a world of Zoom and of digitization in terms of documentation, they've actually got to look beyond into a world without the barriers and boundaries and jurisdictional constraints that they've always operated in. If you talk to a judge, she will say, I run this court and this is my jurisdiction, and she'll be very clear about it. But global commerce doesn't have a jurisdiction. It doesn't go home at 3:30 in the afternoon to play golf. It's 24/7 and it's global. And so if we're going to have courts, generally we're going to have courts that are supporting business in SEZs. They've got to be working when business works, which is they've got to be 24/7, and they've got to be global. And lastly, they've got to have the power to enforce their decisions in the physical world, which they've been doing for hundreds of years, and in the digital world. And to take a court judgment from any current court or arbitration center and to try and cause that to have a nodal shift on a distributed ledger is impossible. So we're going to have to think about the design of a court which is acknowledged and accepted to be a court of the blockchain, a court of the distributed ledger, a court of the smart contract, which parties can rely upon to deal with commerce of the future. And again, these are exactly the kind of issues that we're talking to governments about as they start to think about moving towards the fourth industrial revolution and how, as a state, they're going to respond to an ever-changing global citizenry with different expectations and different ways of doing business.
I mean, what you just mentioned reminded me of a discussion that I had with Andreas previously, and that has to do with the fact that all of, or almost all of, what you mentioned has to do with commercial disputes inside of special economic zones or otherwise. But there's something that Andreas and I spoke about, and that is the different types of disputes that may happen in special economic zones, particularly. And a lot of what happens are disputes between the clients of the SEZ, the tenants, and the zone operator or the local government. And there are different types of disputes that take place. So I was wondering, Andreas, if you could expand a little bit about the different types of disputes that this digital system that Mark just outlined could help solve, and how that's going to be implemented in the SEZs of the future.
So if you're looking at the type of disputes in terms of the pure number of disputes that you'll have, is a lot of disputes between employees and their respective employers. Within the economic zones, you'll have disputes between tenants and the zone authority. So all those contractual disputes rely, as the name already says, on contracts. And by having smart contracts, as Mark mentioned earlier, you can probably just sort out a lot of those conflicts automatically that are currently handled by individual persons. Now, that being said, once again, it comes back to what we talked about at the very, very beginning, which is about a signal of trust. Whatever technology you put in place, whatever solution you have, however advanced it is or however simple it is, depending on your local circumstances in the special economic zone, depending also on the political climate and the political context, whatever you do, the most important thing, and at the end of the day, the decisive thing is, do your investors, do the people who make the decision to be active in your zone or not to be active in your zone, trust what you offer in terms of regulations, and do they trust what will happen if rules or contracts are broken. And this is about what will happen factually, but this is just about as much about this perception, the signaling that we talked about at the beginning.
Absolutely. I think that the marketing and optics aspect of this field might be very relevant for zones in the future. On that note, I'd like to start wrapping up. I want to thank you guys for joining us on the podcast. It was a very enjoyable discussion. If our listeners want to learn more about you, where can they find you on the internet?
Well, you can find us on the web. Our address is www.themetisinstitute.org. Or please reach out to any of us individually. You reach Mark on chairman@themetisinstitute.org, or you reach me on CEO@themetisinstitute.org. We're looking forward to hearing from you.
Right on. That was Andreas and Mark from the Metis Institute. I want to thank everybody who tuned into the Geoeconomics podcast today. Please do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Follow us on wherever you get your podcasts, Stitcher, Castbox, or wherever. And we hope to see you on the next one.